Thank you, Donald. Good evening, everybody. Well, more about Donald Trump in a moment, but I'm here in Brussels, and of course the Prime Minister arrived earlier this afternoon. At dinner, they're talking about Russia, and she's hoping for European solidarity behind the stance that she's taken. And tomorrow morning, from breakfast on, it will be Brexit. But I think we kind of know the terms, really, of what the transition deal is going to be. Certainly our fishermen know what the terms of a transition deal is going to be. Well, joining me here in Brussels for this really billed as very big summit in terms of the road to Brexit is LBC's political editor Theo Usherwood. Theo, tell me, how is Mrs May's day going?
Badly. She wanted, at the end of today, a communique from the European Council, in effect, laying the blame for what happened at Salisbury and the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal to be put at the Kremlin's door. And that simply isn't going to happen. Downing Street privately conceding that. And so therefore, Europe is looking divided. Mrs May doesn't have what she wants, which is the united position from the 27 other member states. And she looks, in the eyes of the Kremlin at least, weaker than if she did have that. Now, we know where the dissent is coming from. It's coming from the likes of Hungary, it's coming from the likes of Greece and Italy, and also from the president of the European Commission himself, Jean-Claude Juncker, who wrote to Vladimir Putin to congratulate him.
I know.
And on the other side, there has been some better news, and that I'll point you towards Lithuania, where the president there has said that they may well follow Britain's lead and expel Russian diplomats from the country. The Baltic states obviously quite nervous about Russian expansionism. So there is a split, but obviously Theresa May wants a more united front.
And a rather bizarre start to her day.
Oh, yes. Theresa May arrives, she gives a statement, and you know the scenario, that £300 million space egg building for a much more grander setting for the short interviews that leaders give. She walks down, she starts speaking, and who should interrupt her but Jean-Claude Juncker, nudging her on the shoulder as she's giving a television interview to say hi. And of course, Theresa May doesn't like doing broadcast interviews. It's not her forte. And then to have the President of the European Commission pushing her off her stride only makes it more difficult.
I will have a bet that Juncker had arrived straight from lunch. That's the only comment I could make on that. And what about, so there'll be a statement at some point late tonight, but as you say, she's not going to get what she wants. And actually, it seems to me, having spent the day here in the European Parliament, that there are quite a few characters around the European Union kind of saying what Corbyn was saying.
Yeah.
Give us some real evidence. Let's wait and see what the international inspectors bring back, from Porton down.
Yes, absolutely. And this is something that Downing Street would point to, is that when you look at the relationships within Europe, we have different levels of trust. Our UK intelligence services have different levels of trust with different countries, and therefore the amount of intelligence we're prepared to share, it varies from country to country. But there is a flip side to that, and the call is, we've heard it from Jeremy Corbyn, is, well, the evidence needs to be produced. You can't just simply say Russia is guilty as charged, and we say that Russia did it, without actually producing the evidence. And that's the difficulty for Theresa May, because obviously we're dealing with an incredibly sensitive situation. We know, a judge this afternoon at the High Court granted permission for the hospital to take blood samples from both Julia and Sergei Skripal, because of course they're unconscious at the moment. They can't give that permission themselves in order to try and make sure they have better treatment. So we're dealing with incredibly sensitive information, and that's where Theresa May, in many ways, can't necessarily put forward the case that she has, or the intelligence services have, against Russia, and that's leading to doubt amongst some nations.
Yeah. And tomorrow morning, no surprises?
No, we're not expecting any surprises. The big announcement came on Monday with Michel Barnier and David Davis announcing the transition deal. The the line, the border when it comes to Northern Ireland, down the Irish Sea, in effect annexing Northern Ireland. What was interesting, though, I think today, that emerged today, is that backstop option that the European Commission has talked about when it comes to Northern Ireland, take it remaining within the customs union while the rest of the UK leaves, mainland Great Britain leaves the European Union. They have actually set a deadline for Britain to come back with another solution, and that's June. At the next European Council, where they want to bounce on to talking about trade. So there is pressure on the British side, the British negotiators, to actually come back with another solution, which many would say can't actually be found. And would that lead to Theresa May holding her hands up in surrender and saying, OK, we'll stay in the customs union?
And that backstop position that the European Union had put up, she said in Parliament, is something that no British Prime Minister could ever accept. So all of that in June. Theo, thank you. So Theresa May not having a great day here in Brussels. I'm asking you, is she facing a disunited Europe? Is the European Union now actually so split on Russia, so split on immigration coming in across the Mediterranean, so split on the euro in terms of the attitude towards it in Germany and in Greece? Is this now a very disunited Europe, and could that be actually a very good reason for us saying, do you know what? On the 29th of March next year, we are going to leave. Harry is calling from Nottingham. Good evening, Harry.
Evening, Nigel. I think we are facing a disunited Europe, and I think it's been a disunited Europe for the past 20 years because the attitudes in Europe towards these issues are very different. So you have Central Europe with France, Germany, Spain, Netherlands, and then you have the Eastern Europe of Hungary, Poland, and then you have the border countries with Russia, such as Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, planning to join the European Union. And I just think that it was partly why the European Union was never going to work, because how can you unite 28 countries on one single issue? There's different types of people. It was never going to work.
Well, I've always thought that, Harry, but Mr. Juncker has a solution to that. Because today is a classic European Union foreign policy dilemma, whereas you quite rightly say different countries, different histories, different connections cannot agree around Mrs. May's Russia position. So what Juncker wants to do is he wants to make sure that foreign policy in future cannot be vetoed by any individual member. So their solution, Harry, to not being able to agree is to make it difficult for countries to stop policy.
Yes, and I think that's partly why I think why we've left the European Union, because of its undemocratic position. If it was a democratic union, as it said, then surely it would allow people to veto it. But obviously there's countries in the European Union such as Finland, Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, who border Russia, and if they take quite a hardline stance on Russia, they're going to be slightly worried that Putin might do a repeat action of Ukraine. So obviously they're going to be a bit more cautious because that's their next door neighbour. It just makes the case further for why I think NATO is the best thing for Europe rather than the EU, because NATO is about a collective defence responsibility, and nations can veto it and they can have different positions, but the
problem there, Harry, the problem there is only a handful of countries are actually paying their way. And Mr. Juncker wants a European army completed by 2025, and he's saying to be in the European army, you only need to pay 1% of your annual GDP, as opposed to the 2% that NATO asks for.
Well, what a dangerous fantasy, according to Nick Clegg, and then obviously that proved to be false.
Remember it very well, yes.
I can remember it well watching you demolish him in the debate. But no, I think the EU army is wholly dangerous because it's undermining the rich history of NATO and what it has done to stand up to Russia. And I think Jean-Claude Juncker, with his European expansionist towards EU army and euro, is only undermining peace in Europe, is only going to cause tension in Europe, and it's only going to go one way. And I just think the European Union will probably crumble in 30 years because all the countries are in disagreement about the refugee crisis, the euro, and I think Brexit...
Well, Harry, I think you've summed it up beautifully, but I tell you what, it won't last 30 years, in my opinion. Thank you. Moving on to Chris in Guildford, a new caller to this show. Good evening, Chris.
Hello to you, Nigel. Yes, I'm really echoing to some extent the points that the last caller made. The EU was unable to come to any conclusion collectively about the Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia situation, and it was left to NATO to go and sort that out. So how anyone expects them to come to a joint view on Russia, which is a great big bear compared with a little mouse, I have no idea.
Well, you could argue, Chris, some would argue that the German recognition of Croatia, and once Germany had done it, the rest of the EU sort of fell into line. You could argue that, in fact, in many ways, they began that conflict.
Well, you could indeed. You could indeed. And, of course, that was not to Serbia's liking. So, you know, how the situation with Russia would be resolved, one hesitates to even begin to wonder, because, of course, many of the Eastern European states feel very much closer to Russia than to the Western European states, including Serbia, for example. So,
is this disunity, Chris, this disunity that Mrs. May is facing today, and I would imagine with a great degree of disappointment, is this disunity a short-term temporary problem, or in fact, is it the very thing that's going to lead to a further unravelling?
I suspect it'll lead to a further unravelling. In a sense, it's the kind of acid test of the whole situation, because here the EU is being asked to come to a joint view. And so far, even countries like Greece are finding it very, very difficult to...
well, I know. And the Greek Prime Minister has been talking on the phone to Vladimir Putin today from inside the very building where Mrs. May is looking for all this unity. Chris, thank you for your call. She's walking on dodgy ground. On the one hand, she wants a deal in the UK's favour with the EU and wants to look strong against Putin. She's having a very, very tough day. But please tell me I'm wrong. Tell me actually the EU is very united and this is just a little local difficulty. You can do that by calling 0345 60 60 973. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show. Well, Mrs. May today is worried about Russia. She wants the European Union to come out with a big act of solidarity. The Lithuanians are saying they may well expel some Russian diplomats in terms of sympathy with the British position, but virtually everybody else is going to do little or nothing. And indeed, Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the European Commission, congratulated Putin, as indeed did Angela Merkel. So she's having a tough day. But the other issue here today that's really been worrying people are Trump's proposed tariffs. Remember, 25% on steel and 10% on aluminium or aluminum if you are an American. And the deadline for this was midnight tonight. And of course, Donald Trump, as ever, playing the game and leaving it to the last minute. Here was Donald Trump a couple of hours ago.
I've been speaking with the highest Chinese representatives, including the president, and I've asked them to reduce the trade deficit immediately by $100 billion. It's a lot. So that would be anywhere from 25%, depending on the way you figure, to maybe something even more than that. But we have to do that. The word that I want to use is reciprocal. When they charge 25% for a car to go in, and we charge 2% for their car to come into the United States, that's not good. That's how China rebuilt itself. The tremendous money that we've paid since the founding of the World Trade Organization, which has actually been a disaster for us. It's been very unfair to us. The arbitrations are very unfair. The judging's been very unfair. And knowingly, we always have a minority, and it's not fair.
So Trump was elected, of course, on this ticket, saying that it wasn't fair, that America was getting a bad deal, and they would, if they thought it was unfair trade, use tariffs. Clearly, this is aimed at China. But there was, shortly after he gave that speech, when we got the detail, a huge sigh of relief here in Brussels, because Trump has decided to pause the import duties that would have applied to European Union countries, and that, of course, includes us as well. We sell about £500 million worth of steel and aluminium goods into the USA every single year. But the emphasis here is it's a pause. He wants trade to be reciprocal, and there is a very big trade deficit between Germany and the United States of America. So he's kind of marked the ground here and he's looking for changes. But back to Mrs. May. She's going to be at dinner very shortly with 27 other leaders of European countries. I think she's facing a disunited Europe. I don't think she's going to get anything positive at all tonight out of this, and I think it really opens up bigger questions about the future of Europe. That's my view. Annabelle is calling from Twickenham. Good evening.
Oh, hello, Nigel.
Hello there.
Very lovely to speak to you this evening. I'd like to point out that how can they speak to us the way in which they do, these countries, when I have seen in the various newspapers that Spain had a demonstration a couple of days back, and according to the Express, there was massive demonstrations of public service people like the doctors, the nurses and everything else in France.
Yeah, there's a big
Bastille buildings and everything. So
big strikes, Annabelle.
Macron and also the Spanish leader, I don't know who he is, how can they talk to us? And also with Merkel being in the weakened state, she ought to play on her weakness and everything. She ought to be as deceitful as they are, and that. And she ought to say to them, well, your country's in not too good a state.
Well, France, Annabelle, France has a big strike today, and I can't, so
why
very
wasn't
few.
It shown on television?
Very few trains running in France today. But you know something? Strikes in France are nothing new. I don't think what's happening in France is exceptional. But you could argue that there is a disunited Spain, given what's been happening in Catalonia over the course of the last 6 months.
You had plenty to say about that in the European Parliament.
Well, I did, and I felt, what struck me, Annabelle, about it was that disunity, as it were, in Spain, the way that it was put down, the sort of brutality, frankly, that was used to put it down, and that was then supported by the leading figures in the European Commission. Mrs. May's not going to get, Annabelle, what she wants tonight. Do you think on the bigger picture that it's a disunited European Union now?
I think it's got massive gaping holes that people don't know about and everything, but it's not being shown to everybody.
Okay, fine. Annabelle, thank you for your point of view. Annabelle thinks the problems are far bigger than anything we can even see. David says by tweet, Nigel, the EU are intentionally not showing their support to the UK over the Russian issue to make us feel more isolated and vulnerable. David, that is possibly true, but I think, actually, they have a completely different foreign policy outlook when it comes to Russia. Many, many of these countries. Tom said, so Europe is divided. You are talking about this as if it's some sort of good thing. We know from history that conflicts, international conflicts, have happened as a result of situations like this one. Most likely victims being the Baltic states. Yet you talk about turning our backs and doing a runner, dividing Europe even more. What depths will you not sink to push your agenda? You have no shame. Well, thank you, whoever sent that in. I want to say this to you. I do not believe in a European army. I certainly don't believe the way to deal with a situation like today where different countries have different views is the Juncker solution to take away nation states' vetoes and to push it onto qualified majority voting. And I worry, whoever you are, I worry that the EU still wants to expand in an eastwards direction. And I think, you mentioned the Baltic states in that message, I think we should put our faith in NATO, and I think we should all start paying the 2% that Donald Trump has asked us to do, because that's what the rules say. And I think that will give us a more stable, safer Europe. I think this European project has hit the buffers with foreign policy, and it's desperate desire to fully militarise. Marco is calling from Ealing, a new caller to the show. Good evening.
Hi, good evening, Nigel. Pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure to talk to you. So I've just been told off, as if, pointing out there's a disunited Europe and wondering whether we can do things differently, as if I'm some sort of warmonger, Marco.
Well, no. Firstly, I want to reiterate what you and your previous caller talked about regarding the EU's role in Yugoslavia. You were quite right. I want to dispel this myth that the EU is some kind of beacon of peace and hope that holds Europe together. Actually, it was Europe's recognition of Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia against the advice of Lord Carrington in the early 90s that caused the horrible civil war that we saw in Yugoslavia. So it's definitely not this, it definitely doesn't promote peace in Europe. That's quite evident from what happened in the Balkans. And on top of that, what is also quite funny, if you want to compare it to the transitional period that we're facing now in Britain, is following those illegal referendums that took place in Croatia, Bosnia and Slovenia, the EU almost instantly, overnight, gave Croatia and Slovenia independence, whereas that is one of the major factors that contributed to the war. Whereas now, with Britain leaving the EU, they've decided, actually, no, it's far more complicated, and we're going to have a long transition period well into 2020. It just reeks of hypocrisy to me.
Yes, and they certainly, Marco, they've certainly got no intention of recognising Mr. Puigdemont or the claims of the Catalans, have they?
Well, exactly. I think, and also to answer your question regarding is it a united Europe at the moment, I think Theresa May is desperately going around, almost embarrassingly, in my opinion, pleading for all these leaders from their countries to speak out and unite against what Russia's done, with actually zero evidence being produced as of yet. I think on the surface it might look like that for many of the European countries, but obviously the leaders of these countries, the policymakers, they're very intelligent people. They're fully aware of what's going on behind the scenes. I'm personally of the opinion that Russia, Putin didn't do it. The truth will come out hopefully eventually. Well,
and why do you think that, Marco?
Without speculation, I'm not a scientist, Nigel. I can't talk to you about the chemical structure of Novichoks and stuff. But going on the facts that we have, the three main things that would point towards Russia not doing it. Firstly, is if you get the opportunity, you could actually ask Theresa May what she actually means by a type of produced by Russia. That's very different to saying it's produced in Russia. She's been very ambiguous with her terminology there. Last week in the House of Commons, she had the chance to clarify what exactly was found, and she deliberately chose to ambiguously say a type of. That's my first point. My second point would be that only last year, the OPCW actually congratulated Russia on completely eradicating their nerve agent program, and have gone on record as saying that Russia never had any Novichok. So I find it extremely bizarre that they're choosing the same organization to come in. How can they now turn around and say, actually, it is Russian, if only last year they accepted the Russian habit?
They're there in Porton Down. We're expecting in a week or so to get those results. But Mrs. May looks to be, Marco, a little bit out on a limb here in Brussels tonight, because there are other European leaders who may not agree with Marco's point of view, but they want actual proof. Thank you. Well, Mrs. May's had a bad day in Brussels. Sir Vince Cable, has had a utterly catastrophic day. More of that in a moment. A very tough dinner here in Brussels for Mrs. May with 27 other leaders of European countries. She wants their full support and solidarity for the action she's taken against Russia over the Salisbury poisoning scandal, and she's not finding very much of it. But if you think she's having a bad day, think about Sir Vince Cable. Yes, I heard this morning Sir Vince Cable was coming to Brussels today. Odd, I thought. I can't remember him coming to a European summit before. Well, it was accompanied, as he arrived, by a press release put out by the Liberal Democrats with a big headline: EU leaders back Lib Dem call for public vote on Brexit deal. Gosh, this is interesting. 8 EU leaders have signed a statement backing the Liberal Democrats' calls for the British public to have another referendum on the final Brexit deal. So that's why Sir Vince was here. There were going to be 8 prime ministers supporting his call for a second referendum. It didn't last very long, because the ALDE party, which is the Party of European Liberals, had a meeting about this and put out a statement pertaining to the Lib Dem press release issued today on Brexit. At the ALDE leaders' meeting of today, no statement has been agreed upon or released, and Andrew Duff, a former Liberal Democrat MEP, said not so fast. In fact, no Liberal Prime Minister does other than backing the Article 50 process. Regretting Brexit is another thing. Everyone sane does that. Well, Andrew would say that. So actually, Vince, you've turned up, you've got off Eurostar, you're coming in for a big grand entrance because you've got 8 prime ministers that are going to support you. That's what your press office have put out this morning, and actually none of them do. Well, I've seen lots of mess-ups, lots of failures in politics. I've been involved in a few of them, but my boy, this is a disaster for Sir Vince Cable. Back to Mrs May and Europe. Do we now have a disunited European Union? Is the approach over Russia and future foreign policy proving that? I'm going to ask Evan in Slough that very question. Good evening.
Hi, Nigel. I thought you said we didn't need the EU, and that, we seem to be whining for the EU to support us against Russia.
Frankly, I think it's actually rather humiliating that a British Prime Minister comes here begging for support. I mean, it's as if she's the one calling for a united EU foreign policy.
You're the one saying, they're disunited in an attempt to whine and say, well, they're disunited, so therefore they're not supporting us. They don't support us, they're disunited.
Okay, what I'm saying, Evan, is they cannot agree.
Sounds like whining to me.
No, not a bit. I think I'm asking Evan people to think a bit more deeply about this.
Are you saying that NATO is the fact? Is that what you're saying?
I am saying that actually the whole move towards a European foreign policy, and goodness knows why our Prime Minister is pushing for it today, but the whole move towards a European foreign policy that Juncker wants, where nation states don't have vetoes and where there's a fully militarized wing of the European Union, I actually think if they're disunited on this and they decide on a different forward approach, that would be a good thing for all of us.
So are you asking Europe to support us?
No. No, I'm not. I'm not asking you to support us.
Okay, so what, you want NATO? You think it's NATO then that will do it?
Well, I think if we're going to look at our future security and how we should operate, So
just clarify to the people out there, NATO is military and Europe would be financial, so we could potentially do... You're suggesting military
Evan,
to Russia. Is that what you're suggesting?
Evan, there's going to be a European army, navy and air force in place
the US has an army.
by 2025, and it's going to have a foreign policy without veto, and it still has pretensions on expanding to the east. I don't think this is a very healthy state of affairs. Do you?
Can I ask you about Trump? I mean, Trump is he supporting you? Is he supporting? You're criticizing the EU, but we're out of the EU now. I mean, according to you, we're Brexit, and therefore. But what about the US? I mean, they're your big buddy. What are they doing? Are you not criticizing them? Are they disunited then because they're not supporting us?
Hang on a second. If you're talking about America and NATO, America, of course, are there, and they are the most important country in NATO. About 75% of military spending in the whole of NATO is America. And what Trump is saying is we will go on supporting Europe, but you all need to pay your way. And I think what Mrs May has exposed by accident today here is the fact that we do have a disunited Europe, and it's time to rethink the future of Europe in terms of military and foreign policy.
You're criticizing Europe and saying they're not supporting us. Is the US supporting us?
I'm not criticizing Europe. Trump has said...
It sounds like it. You said they're disunited. No, so is the US disunited?
I think it's a good thing they're disunited. I think it gives us a chance to have
the US
a bigger debate.
On the contrary...
President Trump has
as you well know, Trump will not...
May.
As you well know, Trump is not
supported Mrs May, and he said it was probably the Russians that...
So did the EU support... The EU also supported it, and they said the same thing. But the fact is, neither Trump nor the EU is going to step up to the plate until we actually get the independent status on that. And you know that. And not only do you know that, that Trump has just raised a trade war against potentially China. And that's a far worse situation. And here you are talking about disunited Europe when the US is looking at...
Evan, you're moving on to different subjects, but I have to say there may be a few people listening in South Wales and in Redcar who perhaps wish we had stopped a lot of cheap, overproduced steel, putting them out of business. Evan, you have a different point of view. That's fine. Dolores is calling me from Twickenham. Good evening, Dolores.
Hello, Nigel. I should call you Mr. Farage, really.
You know, when we come to Mrs. Thatcher, oh, God bless her soul, Mrs. May, she is good. She's a good woman. That's why European head of states are doing what they're doing. But unless every head of state is like her, there's not going to be any peace. She's soft. She is soft. She is no good as a prime minister. She is not a Mrs. Thatcher.
Well, Dolores, what many would say is that actually, over Russia, she acted very quickly, she sounded tough, she took action. So there are some people who say that over Russia, she's shown herself to be a good leader.
Yes, good leader accusing somebody when you don't have any proof.
Well,
how can I accuse you of doing something when you say to me, no, I didn't do it? I mean, we're talking about Russia. We're talking about, what you call it, a power.
With a very big power, and one that could be sinister. Dolores, thank you, and Dolores takes the view you've got to have proof to do these things, and actually that's the view that many other European leaders, it appears, are taking here tonight. Irina says, EU disunity, re Russia, is not necessarily a bad thing, as those member states that are reluctant to condemn over Salisbury enable diplomatic channels to stay open. EU unity would only ratchet up conflict with Russia. Irina, I absolutely agree, particularly with that final point, and Jeremy Corbyn would agree with the one you made before. James is calling from Harlow. Good evening, James.
Good evening. Yeah, I think we have got United Europe, but not in the way that's good for the European Union. I'm a Brexit supporter. I like to get, like, what British independence, but you get my point. I like to read both sides of the argument, you know, the papers of both sides. So I was reading one of the pro-European papers this morning from the European, from, you know, the local newspapers in near the European Union.
Yeah.
And from what I'm reading, it almost seems as if we're heading for a clash of titans, sort of like Rocky versus Apollo, between the European Commission and the European Parliament. And I was watching some of the clips you've uploaded, well, not you, but supporters upload on YouTube. Whenever Junk's in that room, Verhofstadt's got this look in his eyes, like a tiger waiting to pounce. And I was reading that there's comments as well from the Irish Taoiseach today. What was it? If Britain gets a special trade deal and considers Ireland's interest, will be the test of if Europe's worth staying in. And also, what Europe does after will largely test, is this really for the small states or the big states?
Well, that's a really big question, James, because I think there is increasingly a feeling amongst smaller countries that it has become a German-dominated Europe, and certainly in the economics of it.
Franco. You know, what was really interesting... Sorry, go on.
A German what, do you say?
Basically German-France Empire. Back to them.
Well, I mean, like, you know...
on top.
They've always been the two big countries. I think there are some very fundamental questions that smaller countries, James, are now asking themselves.
But what was very interesting this morning, right, this was from, I can't remember what it was from, it's from one of the bigwigs, the actual European Federalist, who's saying we need to question whether the European can survive without nations having sovereignty. That's from a Federalist. So these people are clearly, I think the Italian election has shocked them.
I tell you what, James, I don't think the European Union cannot survive if nation-states have sovereignty. That's my view. Thanks for your call. Thanks for your enthusiasm. Nigel, just what do you think Putin is after? A strong Europe? No. Just what do you think China would like? What do you think the financial houses of the Far East want? A divided Europe, obviously, and you want to give it to them. I want to give them a different kind of Europe. A Europe where nation-states work together, trade together, but don't have political union or grand designs on becoming a world power. History is littered with people who want to become world powers, causing all sorts of very, very bad trouble. Mrs. May facing a tough dinner tonight. I kind of think she thought that the European Union would all rally round, would all agree with her position and her action on Russia and say for she's a jolly good chap. But it hasn't happened that way. And a lot of them are being very cautious. Some of them, there have been quite big electoral shifts, particularly in Italy, where now parties that are quite pro-Putin did incredibly well in that general election recently. I genuinely think we're looking at a very disunited Europe tonight, and I wonder whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I think that maybe it gives some opportunities to rethink the future of the European project, and in particular, our security as the European continent. Michael is calling from Hampton. Good evening, Michael.
I spoke to you before, Nigel. I can't understand why Theresa May has to go cap in hand to the Europeans. If our experts have said that the odds are that this nerve gas was made in Russia, why do we have to go to the European Union, who are obviously not going to support us for various reasons, and ask for their support? It's a no-brainer. She's not going to get it.
Well, she clearly thought, Michael, they would support her, and I did see a guy called Franz Timmermans. He's Juncker's deputy, and he was speaking in the European Parliament last week, a very powerful speech in which he said it is over issues like this that we all come together united, and that is why we have a European Union. And I wonder whether she heard some of those messages and kind of thought that they would cheer her to the rafters.
Well, the Baltic states are worried about her. A lot of the European Union don't want to upset Russia too much, particularly when they don't really have that much interest in what goes on with a chap bumped off in Britain, whether they're going to upset the Russians by agreeing with Mrs. May. If she's got proof, and our experts have said that the odds are it's made in Russia, I still can't, as I say, I can't see why she needs to go cap in hand to the European Union and ask for their support. We're in NATO.
So has she made a strategic error of judgment in doing this today, in your view?
I think Mr. Boris Johnson has made an error, and I think she's made an error. I don't think she's very well advised.
Well, Boris is completely out there, isn't he? I mean, he's saying that the World Cup football will be used by Putin's regime as Hitler used the Olympics in 1936.
Well, I agree with a lot of people in saying 20 million, you're a student of the Second World War, that 20 million Russians gave up their lives to prevent the Germans, and if they hadn't done that, I think the outcome of the war may have been slightly different.
Yeah, well, Michael, I understand what you're saying. So why has Boris gone as over the top as this?
Because I don't know. I really don't know what to think the man's thinking. I regard him, I don't know why everybody think he's got charisma. To me, ever since I've seen him, he's just, I think he's a little bit of a clown, and I don't know why he does it. I've no idea why the man makes a statement like that.
Well, I wondered, Michael, yesterday, was it something that he'd predetermined, or did it just happen off the cuff in response?
I think it's off the cuff. I don't think...
So do I.
He's supposed to be an intelligent man, and I think he sort of thought let's get some sort of kudos out of it by saying, well, we were standing up to the Russians, and I'll add fuel to the flame. I think it's the worst thing that any foreign secretary I've ever heard of has done in my lifetime.
Didn't look that responsible, Michael. No, I would agree with you.
I think it's totally... I mean, there are ways of stating things, but that was a bit too open.
I have a feeling that a vast majority of listeners to this show right now, Michael, think you're right. Thank you very much indeed for your call. Now, Theo Usherwood, LBC's political editor, is back in the room with me with the latest news. Theo.
We have a statement from Number 10 saying that the Prime Minister Theresa May met with the French President Emmanuel Macron and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel at the fringes of the European Council this afternoon. That's away from the main auditorium where everybody sits around with their headsets on and speaks to each other. And they say that, according to this statement, the Prime Minister provided the President and the Chancellor with a detailed update on the investigation into the reckless use of a military nerve agent of a type produced by Russia on the streets of Salisbury. The Prime Minister said there had been a positive identification of the chemical used as part of the Novichok group of nerve agents by our world-leading scientists at Porton Down. The Prime Minister also outlined our knowledge that Russia has previously produced the agent, Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, and our assessment that Russia views some defectors as legitimate targets for assassination. The UK, Germany and France reaffirmed that there is no plausible explanation other than that the Russian state was responsible, and they agreed on the importance of sending a strong European message in response to Russia's actions and agreed to remain in close contact in the coming days.
So she'll feel she's made some progress with that, will she?
Some progress, yes. Obviously, getting the support of Emmanuel Macron and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel is a step in the right direction from the Prime Minister's point of view, but of course that isn't, they're the two leading members of the EU Council, but that's not the entirety of the European Council by any stretch.
Because we've got Greece, and we've got Italy, and we've got Hungary, and there's very unlikely, I would have thought tonight, to be any concerted action that comes as a result of
No,
this.
the big prize, Nigel, was a communique linking Russia directly from the European Council to what happened in Salisbury, and that isn't going to happen, and Theresa May is going to miss out on that. And then, of course, that creates the narrative, doesn't it, that Europe is divided when it comes to Russia and Theresa May.
And any thoughts on Sir Vince Cable's day over here?
It didn't go very well, did it? The problem the Liberal Democrats have at the moment is that they had some really talented press officers in their headquarters, and of course what's happened is that lost so many MPs over the last couple of years, since the 2015 election. Those young staffers, well, actually some of them aren't so young, have gone on to other things, many of them in the private sector, and they haven't replaced them. This was just a really standard error, schoolgirl error that shouldn't have been made. You sign it off. You make sure that you sign off that you're not.
But it looked like Vince Cable was coming to meet 8 prime ministers who supported a second referendum.
Yeah, but if it's not true, then it's not much good.
It's not good, is it? No, I agree. Theo, thank you very much indeed. Dave says by text, Juncker congratulated Putin. That says it all. Trump did as well, mind you. Gary is my next caller from Dollis Hill. Gary, good evening.
Good evening to you, Nigel. I would agree with you in saying the countries in the European Union are not united, and if people would just take their eyes off the usual mainstream media suspects like Sky, like BBC, just take their eyes off them and look at alternative outlets, they would see that. But Nigel, it pains me to say, but our country is far from united. An engineer friend of mine, I was speaking to him just after Christmas. He was working on the 5,000 kilometre long Druzhba oil pipeline in Russia, and Russians look at us, and they look at us as weak now, Nigel. So if they look at us as weak, Putin looks at us as weak.
But Gary, Mrs. May, whether you agree with the stance she's taken or not, for the first time in her premiership, Mrs. May has actually looked strong over this, hasn't she?
No, I feel a hologram over there would be better than her. But I mean, the thing I want to ring, Nigel, was about our country. It's got an enemy within which is going to get worse, and we should be looking at that. That's what I thought we should
What's the enemy within, Gary?
Well, the last year and a half, 2 years, we've had these terrible incidents in London, up in Manchester. They're going to get worse as these people get more radicalised, and we're still letting more in. And Russia can see that, Putin can see that, and that's our problem.
Let's hope you're wrong, Gary. But I tell you what. Whatever we think of Putin, even if we hate him, on that battle against radical Islamic terrorism, we do actually find ourselves on the same side. Thank you. I get a tweet that says, in terms of Russia, I would love to stand behind Theresa May 100%. However, her recent lies she's made about Brexit, I just cannot find myself being able to believe her 100%. Okay, well, Mrs. May, in for a tough evening. It is a disunited Europe. It's going to find it very difficult ever to agree substantially on foreign policy unless Mr. Juncker gets his way and is able to take away vetoes of nation states and do it all by qualified majority voting. The European Union could only be united on issues like this if it takes away the ability of nation states to function democratically. That's my view.